and welcome from Marrakech, one of the major economic hubs in the Kingdom of Morocco. My name is Fifi Peters. It's day 2 of the 52nd Annual Conference of Ministers, where the conversation is about fiscal policy, trade and private sector involvement in the digital era. Today we will be hearing about the progress that the least developed countries on the continent have made in graduating to become developing countries. It is, of course, still International Women's Month, and therefore prudent to hear what the Economic Commission for Africa is doing to balance the scales between men and women. So all this and more, let us get straight to it.
When we talk about the CFTA, everybody says, but look at what happened in Europe, look at what's happening in the United States. It created a sort of a bottom base that was disgruntled, who lost jobs, who did not feel included in this sort of globalization drive. And I think the important thing now that we have on the continent is this match between the CFTA Agenda 2030 that says leave no one behind, and Agenda 2063 that says the Africa we want. And I think we can take lessons from, what went wrong with the initial globalization drive, which was really a rent-seeking drive, which was said, we will create the wealth and then you will be part of it. And right now what we're trying to do with the CFTA, and I think that's why this work is important, is to say we must do it together. We must ensure that it's not just growth, but it's growth with equity. How will the CFTA benefit the rural Africa, which is where we have a lot of the lower incomes? I think that is those are the kinds of pieces of work we now need to focus on, so that it's not just about STEM and high tech and digital innovation, but how can we take those kinds of innovations back to the people in the rural areas and ensure that they are part of this growing global economy that we believe will come out.
Africa has 33 of the 47 least developed countries in the world. These countries have special needs and require special assistance to build capacity, to fund investment, to promote economic and social development. And they also have special issues related to governance, related to food security, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So as a matter of fact, most of LDCs, and almost all of them, made progress in terms of human development since 2010. But the progress has been very slow and volatile. And they need to really increase growth, increase social development, improve social development, and so forth and so on, in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of Agenda 2063 of the African Union.
There's the number of issues that you did mention. There was quite a number that were raised in your session. You did mention good governance. You did mention the fact around electricity, or access to power and access to affordable power, as being some of the constraints that have held these countries from progressing even further. For you, what would you say is the biggest headwind that is constraining further development in these LDCs?
The biggest headwind in LDCs is security and governance. So unless we improve on security and on governance, political, economic, and corporate governance, progress will remain slow. You need security and improved governance in order to attract investment, domestic investment as well as foreign investment, and to make better use of the resources available to you, and to be able to mobilize more resources to invest on infrastructure and on human development.
So we're here to look at, how to address some of the major challenges that Africa is facing, and one of those right now is unemployment, and specifically youth unemployment. What kind of tools or solutions are you guys discussing in accelerating dealing with this problem?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program. The theme of this meeting is on fiscal policy, trade, private sector, a strategy for Africa. Basically, we're looking at how we can expand the base of production, how we can create a more inclusive manufacturing environment, how can we use digital instruments to open up opportunities for our young people. And what has been demonstrated very clearly in Africa is that African youth, they've demonstrated capacity to be able to come to terms with the reality of the digital economy. If we see the kind of changes and dynamics taking place, within the innovation sector of technology, we will see that our young people are doing a lot in that regard. So what do we need to do? We need to create the policy space for them. We need to give them incentives. We need to unlock the technological capacity of our young people. If we're able to do that, they will be able to not only move into the digital economy, but also to be employers themselves. If you look at a country like Mauritius, the kind of progress they are making has to do with the space they've given to innovation, creativity and innovation. So that has to be our new language, particularly in the digital sector. How do we encourage young people? A lot of African youth, are very much interested in doing this. I recall discussing with some youth in a particular Southern African country, which is my region, and they are saying, we don't want the government to spoon feed us. We want the government to unleash our potentials, our creativity. That's what we want. Create the space for us. Let us move with this. And if we look at the experience of India, that is making so much progress, it is predicated on software technology, which is being driven by young people in India. So that's the kind of incentive regime that we need to create to be able to open up that environment for them to be able to move and drive development. And it has to be tied also with the educational system.
We have this conversation on the back of an announcement from the United Nations throwing their full weight behind Caster Semenya, saying that it's not right for any woman to be discriminated in any form when it comes to the sporting fraternity. Now, as an arm of the United Nations, help us understand what the ECA's position is when it comes to gender parity and what you guys are doing to drive the movement of gender parity forward.
Thank you, Fifi. I think, clearly, when you look at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, you enter its doors. What is the face that you see? For the first time, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has a female executive secretary. We are 60 years old, and for 60 years, we've never had a female executive secretary. And that really does say a lot about the organization. And on the other hand, we put at the forefront of our work gender equality and women's rights. We've just had a restructuring in the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. My division used to be the Social Development Policy Division. Now it's being called Gender, Poverty, and Social Policy. Already you can see that at the forefront of the naming of the division is gender, emphasizing the importance of gender equality and women's empowerment in the organization. And our programming in the division on our program on gender emphasizes 1, women's economic empowerment, 2, women's rights, 3, women's access to factors of production. And there we are talking about access to land, access to resources, access to labor. So you can see what drives the program of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. As we speak, we are preparing for the review of the Beijing Platform for Action. And if you look at the Beijing Platform for Action, what do you find in it? For me, it's a document that over decades will continue to be relevant.
The mining and the resources sectors are seen as very key in improving economic growth in the continent, but also improving job prospects. But the problem is it can't be exploited or used in the same manner if we're really going to achieve a form of inclusive growth, because we need a situation or a playing field where African economies have got more ownership of their natural resources. Just tell us the kind of conversations that are happening at the ECA to ensure that some of the injustices are addressed in the African or in Africa's natural resources sector.
The problematic of natural resource exploitation in Africa has been recognized for some time. As you know, in 2009, the AU African Union Heads of State and Summit adopted the African Mining Vision as a framework to promote a new development model in the extractive industry, moving from a case where the extractive industry constitutes an enclave with very few linkages with the local economy to one where there is a greater share of local content, there is greater beneficiation, value additions, and there is more linkages between the extractive sector and the other sectors of the economy. So a couple of countries already on the continent are domesticating the African mining vision, basically trying to translate the key tenets of the vision into policy strategies, context-specific policies and strategies. But as you've said, more needs to be done, because notwithstanding the adoption of the African mining vision in 2009, one could argue that the sector composition of our exports remain essentially based on the export of raw materials. So the share of manufacturers in total exports is minimal, and that all reflects the status in which that has necessitated the formulation of the adoption vision.
How can intra-Africa trade help more countries to graduate from being LCDs?
Intra-Africa trade and the signing of the Continental Free Trade Agreement present opportunities, huge opportunities for all African countries. In our analysis in the Economic Commission for Africa, we expect implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area to have a significant impact on investment and growth on the continent.
We are hoping that between technology, policy, and some good leadership, we will be able to make the CFTA work without all the mistakes of the past.